The taste of amasec mixed with blood still burns my throat from when I first pulled the trigger on a loyal Imperial Guard officer. My name is Commissar Viktor Krauss, former enforcer of the Emperor's will, and I have seen what happens when the machinery of Imperial justice becomes more corrupt than the enemies it claims to fight. You think that makes me a traitor and heretic, but you don't know what I discovered in the command bunkers beneath Mordian Prime. I've executed men who died believing they served the Emperor's glory. I've watched generals sacrifice entire regiments to cover their own cowardice. For 15 years, I enforced discipline with bolt pistol and chainsword, believing I was preserving the Imperium's strength. The truth is far more brutal. I was merely another weapon in the hands of those who would see humanity burn for their personal gain. Now they hunt me across the galaxy, and I hunt them in return. Chapter 1. The Last Execution. The morning of my last official execution dawned red over the trenches of Skarth VII, the crimson light filtering through smoke and ash to cast everything in shades of blood and damnation. I stood in the command bunker 50 meters behind the front lines, watching through the periscope as another wave of Imperial Guard prepared to advance against the Orc positions that had held firm for 3 months of grinding warfare. The scent of promethium fuel mixed with the ever-present stench of death created an atmosphere that had become as familiar as breathing. Colonel Vastian of the 47th Mordian Iron Guard stood beside me, his uniform immaculate, despite the conditions that had reduced most of his men to hollow-eyed survivors, coated in the grime of perpetual conflict. His pale blue eyes held the cold calculation that marked career officers who had learned to view human lives as expendable resources rather than the Emperor's faithful servants. At 37 years old, he commanded 8,000 men with the casual indifference that senior Imperial Guard officers developed as protection against the weight of constant death. "Commissar Krauss," he said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of Mordian nobility. "We have a discipline problem that requires your immediate attention. Major Hendrik of the 3rd Battalion has been spreading defeatist sentiment among his men, questioning the tactical soundness of today's offensive." I studied the tactical display that showed our forces arrayed against Orc defensive positions that had been reinforced over weeks of failed assaults. The green-skinned savages had constructed a killing field that would consume hundreds of Imperial lives for every meter of ground gained. Yet the orders from Sector Command demanded immediate advance regardless of casualties, driven by political pressures that had nothing to do with military necessity. "What specifically has Major Hendrik said that constitutes defeatism?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Hendrik was a veteran of 2 decades of warfare, a competent officer whose tactical assessments had saved lives in previous campaigns. His crime would be speaking obvious truths that contradicted official optimism. He told his men that the offensive is doomed to fail and that they are being sent to die for no strategic purpose, Colonel Vastian replied, his tone carrying satisfaction at having identified a clear violation of Imperial discipline. Such words undermine morale and fighting effectiveness. The penalty is clear. I had performed 47 executions during my 15-year career as a commissar, each one justified by regulations that demanded absolute loyalty to command authority, regardless of circumstances. Men who questioned orders, who showed cowardice in the face of the enemy, who allowed fear or doubt to interfere with their duties, all had faced my bolt pistol with the blessing of Imperial law and the certainty that their deaths served the greater good. Yet as I walked through the trenches toward Major Hendrik's position, I found myself examining the faces of the men who would advance in less than an hour. They were boys, most of them, recruited from hive cities and agri-worlds across the sector and trained just enough to hold a lasgun without shooting themselves. Their eyes held the hollow look of soldiers who knew they were going to die but lacked the authority to refuse the orders that would kill them. Major Hendrik was inspecting his men's equipment when I arrived at his command post, a reinforced dugout that offered minimal protection from the Orc artillery that fell sporadically across our lines. At 43 years old, he bore the scars of countless battles. His left arm, replaced with a crude bionic after a greenskin chopper, had severed it during the Genna campaign. His men looked to him with the trust that came from serving under an officer who had repeatedly demonstrated his competence and concern for their survival. "Major," I said formally, activating the recording device that would document his final words for the regimental archives. "You are charged with spreading defeatist sentiment and undermining Imperial morale in the face of the enemy. How do you answer these charges?" His response embodied everything I had come to expect from experienced Imperial Guard officers who had seen too much warfare to maintain comfortable illusions about their situation. "I told my men the truth, Commissar. This offensive will fail because it was planned by fools who care more about political appearances than tactical reality. We're attacking reinforced positions with insufficient artillery support and no reserve forces to exploit any breakthrough we might achieve. The men deserve to understand what they're facing." "The men deserve to follow orders without question," I replied, though the words felt hollow as I spoke them. "Doubt and hesitation get soldiers killed more surely than enemy action. Your duty is to instill confidence and determination, not to share your tactical concerns with enlisted personnel who lack the training to understand them." Hendrik's scarred face showed no fear as he faced the bolt pistol I had drawn from its holster. His men watched in silence, their expressions mixing respect for their commander with the resignation that marked Imperial Guard soldiers who had learned to expect betrayal from their own side as often as from the enemy. "Commissar," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space of the command post. "I've served the Emperor for 23 years. I've led men through hell and brought them back alive when other officers would have spent their lives for meaningless objectives. If speaking truth about impossible odds makes me a traitor, then the Imperium has lost its way more completely than I thought." I had heard similar words from other condemned men, soldiers whose only crime was understanding their situation clearly enough to recognize the futility of their assigned missions. Each execution had been justified by regulations that prioritized obedience over competence, loyalty over truth, compliance over the preservation of Imperial lives. The bolt pistol felt heavier than usual as I raised it to Hendrik's forehead. The familiar weight of Imperial justice transformed into something that felt more like murder than righteous execution. Around us, his men prepared for an advance that would kill most of them within the first 10 minutes of contact with enemy forces. Their deaths would serve no strategic purpose beyond satisfying the egos of commanders who refused to admit their tactical errors. "Any final words, Major?" I asked, following the protocol that had governed every execution I had performed in service to the Emperor's will. "Tell them I died believing in the Emperor's protection," he replied, his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his brain. "Tell them I never stopped fighting for the men under my command, even when that fight was against the incompetence of my superiors." I pulled the trigger, and Major Hendrik's head exploded in a spray of blood and brain matter that painted the bunker walls in patterns that would haunt my dreams for years to come. His body collapsed instantly, the life leaving his eyes as his consciousness was obliterated by the mass-reactive bolt that had been designed to execute the Emperor's justice with clinical efficiency. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity before I spoke the ritual words that concluded every commissarial execution. "Let this be a lesson to all who would place personal judgment above Imperial duty. The Emperor's will is absolute, and those who question it face absolute consequences." But as I holstered my weapon and prepared to return to the command bunker, I noticed something that had never occurred after my previous executions. The men of the 3rd Battalion weren't looking at me with the mixture of fear and respect that usually followed a commissarial killing. Instead, they were looking at me with something approaching hatred, their eyes holding the cold recognition that I had just murdered the only officer who had demonstrated genuine concern for their welfare. I walked back through the trenches in silence, my mind processing the implications of what I had just done. For 15 years, I had believed that maintaining discipline through fear and summary execution served the greater good of Imperial military effectiveness. I had convinced myself that killing officers who questioned orders was necessary to preserve the chain of command that kept Imperial Guard units functioning under impossible conditions. Yet the faces of Hendrik's men told a different story. They would advance because they had no choice, but they would do so knowing that their own command structure viewed them as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of competent leadership. The execution I had just performed hadn't strengthened Imperial discipline. It had destroyed whatever faith those soldiers retained in the justice of the system they served. Colonel Vastian received my report with the satisfaction of a man who had eliminated a troublesome subordinate while maintaining plausible deniability about his own tactical shortcomings. "Excellent work, Commissar. I trust there will be no further discipline problems in the 3rd Battalion." "No, sir," I replied, though I suspected the discipline problems were just beginning. Men who had lost faith in their command structure rarely performed with the dedication that Imperial military doctrine demanded. The 3rd Battalion would advance as ordered, but they would do so as reluctant conscripts rather than motivated soldiers. The offensive began at 800 hours with an artillery barrage that lasted exactly 7 minutes, insufficient to suppress the Orc defensive positions, but adequate to alert the enemy that an attack was imminent. As predicted, the Imperial Guard advance stalled within minutes of leaving the trenches, caught in crossfire from positions that should have been neutralized by proper preparatory bombardment. From the command bunker, I watched through optical scopes as men died in waves, their bodies cut down by weapons fire that turned the battlefield into a charnel house of Imperial flesh and blood. The 3rd Battalion, led by a captain who had assumed command after Hendrik's execution, performed with mechanical precision, but without the tactical flexibility that might have saved lives under desperate circumstances. By noon, the offensive had been called off with casualties exceeding 30% of the attacking force. The Orc positions remained intact, the tactical situation unchanged except for the addition of several hundred more Imperial corpses to the killing field that stretched between the opposing forces. I spent the afternoon writing reports that would describe the offensive as a limited success that had gathered valuable intelligence about enemy dispositions. The men who had died would be listed as heroes who had given their lives in service to the Emperor's glory, their deaths transformed into propaganda that would encourage other young men to accept similar fates without question. Yet as I sat in my quarters that evening, cleaning the blood from my bolt pistol and preparing for whatever disciplinary actions tomorrow might require, I found myself questioning assumptions that had guided my entire career. Major Hendrik had been right about the tactical situation, right about the futility of the offensive, right about the incompetence of the command structure that had ordered it. His execution hadn't served Imperial interests. It had silenced the only voice that might have prevented a senseless waste of Imperial lives. The Emperor protects, but sometimes his protection requires servants who are willing to question orders that would destroy what they claim to preserve. That night, for the first time in 15 years of loyal service, I began to wonder whether the greatest threat to the Imperium might not be external enemies, but the corruption and incompetence of the system I had sworn to defend. Chapter 2. Seeds of Doubt. The weeks following Major Hendrik's execution brought a series of events that would fundamentally alter my understanding of Imperial justice and my role as its enforcer. The tactical situation on Skarth VII deteriorated as the Orcs launched a counter-offensive that exploited the weaknesses created by our failed assault, while morale problems spread throughout the regiment like a virus that no amount of summary execution could cure. Colonel Vastian's response to these challenges revealed the moral bankruptcy that I was beginning to recognize as endemic throughout the Imperial Guard command structure. Rather than acknowledging the tactical errors that had led to our defeats, he blamed the failures on insufficient dedication among the enlisted personnel and demanded increasingly harsh disciplinary measures to restore what he called proper Imperial spirit. "The men lack the killer instinct that separates Imperial soldiers from mere rabble," he declared during a command staff meeting held in the reinforced bunker that served as regimental headquarters. "Too many of them still think like civilians rather than warriors of the Emperor. We need to eliminate this weakness through demonstration of consequences." His solution was to implement collective punishment protocols that would hold entire squads responsible for the perceived failures of individual members. Soldiers who showed hesitation under fire would see their comrades executed alongside them. Units that failed to achieve impossible objectives would be decimated according to ancient Roman tradition, every 10th man shot to encourage better performance from the survivors. I had witnessed collective punishment during my service on other worlds, understanding it as a necessary tool for maintaining discipline when conventional methods proved insufficient. Yet the specific implementation Colonel Vastian proposed seemed designed more to satisfy his personal frustration than to address genuine military problems. The men he wanted punished weren't cowards or traitors. They were experienced soldiers whose morale had been broken by incompetent leadership and meaningless casualties. The first test of the new disciplinary regime came when 3rd Company failed to hold an advanced position during another Orc assault. The tactical situation had been hopeless from the beginning, with the company deployed in an exposed salient that could be attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. When they were forced to withdraw after sustaining 70% casualties, Colonel Vastian declared their retreat to be an act of cowardice that demanded exemplary punishment. "Commissar Krauss," he ordered, "you will select 10 men from 3rd Company for execution. Their deaths will remind the rest of the regiment that withdrawal without orders is tantamount to treason, regardless of the tactical circumstances involved." I spent the night reviewing the service records of 3rd Company's survivors, looking for soldiers whose execution might serve some military purpose beyond satisfying the colonel's need for scapegoats. What I found instead were the files of men who had served with distinction through months of grinding warfare, whose only crime was surviving situations that had killed better soldiers through sheer chance. Sergeant Molotov had led 3 successful raids against Orc positions, bringing back intelligence that had saved lives in subsequent operations. Corporal Vance had single-handedly carried 2 wounded comrades to safety during the company's retreat, risking his own life to preserve Imperial fighting strength. Private Kellerman was 19 years old, a farm boy from an agri-world who had shown remarkable courage despite having no previous military experience. None of them deserved to die for the tactical incompetence of their superiors, yet Imperial regulations gave me the authority and responsibility to execute them regardless of their individual merit. The choice I faced was between blind obedience to orders that violated every principle of military justice and open defiance of the command structure I had sworn to serve. The execution was scheduled for dawn, conducted before the assembled regiment to maximize its psychological impact on the surviving soldiers. I stood in the central courtyard of our fortified position, watching the selected men take their positions against the execution wall with the dignity that marked veteran Imperial Guard personnel facing death in service to the Emperor. Sergeant Molotov looked directly at me as I raised my bolt pistol, his eyes holding no anger or resentment, but rather a sad understanding that we were both trapped in a system that had lost its moral foundation. "Commissar," he said quietly, "tell my family I died fighting the Emperor's enemies, not shot by his servants for doing my duty." The words hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the reality of what I was about to do. These men weren't traitors or cowards. They were loyal Imperial soldiers being murdered to satisfy the ego of an incompetent officer who refused to accept responsibility for his own failures. Their deaths would serve no military purpose beyond demonstrating that the Imperial command structure valued obedience over justice. For the first time in my career as a commissar, I hesitated. The bolt pistol remained aimed at Sergeant Molotov's head, but my finger refused to pull the trigger that would end the life of a man who had served the Emperor with distinction while his superiors had failed him repeatedly. Around us, the assembled regiment watched in silence, their faces showing the hollow resignation of soldiers who had learned to expect betrayal from their own officers. "Commissar," Colonel Vastian's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, "you will carry out the execution immediately, or I will find another officer capable of performing necessary duties." The threat was clear: refuse to murder these men, and I would join them against the execution wall. Yet as I looked into Sergeant Molotov's eyes, I realized that preserving my own life by taking his would transform me into the kind of monster that the Imperium claimed to fight against. The choice was between personal survival and moral integrity, between comfortable corruption and dangerous truth. I lowered the bolt pistol and spoke words that would mark the beginning of my transformation from loyal commissar to hunted rogue. I cannot execute these men for failures that were not their own. They performed their duties with honor under impossible circumstances. Their deaths would not serve Imperial interests. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever before Colonel Vastian drew his own sidearm and aimed it at my head. "Commissar Krauss, you are hereby relieved of duty and charged with failure to perform your sworn obligations. The penalty for such dereliction is death." But before he could pull the trigger, Sergeant Molotov and his condemned comrades acted with the tactical precision that had kept them alive through months of warfare. Moving as a coordinated unit despite their restraints, they overwhelmed the guards who had been positioned around the execution wall and seized their weapons with practiced efficiency. "Colonel," Molotov called out, his lasgun now trained on the regimental commander, "perhaps we should discuss the tactical situation like reasonable soldiers, rather than murdering loyal Imperial personnel to cover your incompetence." What followed was 3 hours of desperate negotiation, during which the true extent of corruption within the regimental command structure became apparent. Colonel Vastian and his senior officers had been systematically falsifying casualty reports and tactical assessments to conceal their repeated failures from sector command. Regiments that should have been reinforced or withdrawn had been abandoned to die because admitting losses would have reflected poorly on their career advancement prospects. "We've lost over 60% of our effective strength," Molotov explained as he presented documentation that painted a picture of systemic deception. "But the reports being sent to headquarters claim we're at 80% combat effectiveness and achieving tactical objectives. Meanwhile, men are dying because we can't get the ammunition and medical supplies that command thinks we do not need." The revelation transformed my understanding of the war we were fighting and my role within it. I had been enforcing discipline in service to a command structure that cared more about maintaining comfortable lies than protecting the soldiers under its authority. The executions I had performed hadn't preserved Imperial fighting strength. They had silenced witnesses to criminal negligence that was destroying Imperial forces from within. The immediate tactical situation required decisions that would determine whether we lived to expose the corruption we had discovered or died as examples of what happened to those who questioned Imperial authority. Colonel Vastian still commanded the loyalty of officers who shared his guilt, while the enlisted personnel were divided between those who supported the revelation of truth and those who feared the consequences of rebellion against established authority. The resolution came when the Orcs launched a massive assault that threatened to overrun our positions entirely. Faced with immediate extinction, the ideological divisions within the regiment became irrelevant compared to the practical necessity of coordinated resistance. Sergeant Molotov assumed tactical command with my support, implementing defensive strategies that Colonel Vastian had rejected as too aggressive despite their obvious military value. The battle lasted 14 hours, during which Imperial Guard soldiers fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were defending more than just territory. They were fighting for the principle that competent leadership and tactical honesty were more important than rigid adherence to hierarchical authority. The successful defense of our positions validated everything Molotov and his supporters had claimed about the failures of the existing command structure. Colonel Vastian died during the fighting, killed by Orc fire, while attempting to flee the command bunker rather than coordinate the defense he had claimed was impossible. His death removed the immediate threat of court-martial and execution, but it also created a command vacuum that would have to be filled by someone willing to accept responsibility for the illegal actions we had taken. I found myself promoted to acting regimental commander by default, inheriting authority over soldiers who looked to me for leadership, while knowing that my first official act had been refusing to execute loyal Imperial personnel. The precedent was dangerous. If commissars could choose which orders to obey based on personal moral judgment, the entire Imperial command structure might collapse into chaos. Yet the alternative was to continue enforcing policies that weakened Imperial fighting strength while protecting incompetent officers from the consequences of their failures. The men under my command had proven that tactical competence and concern for soldier welfare produced better military results than blind obedience to flawed authority. As I prepared reports that would inevitably lead to investigation of our actions, I realized that I had crossed a line from which there could be no return. I was no longer a commissar enforcing Imperial discipline. I was a rogue officer who had chosen truth over comfort justice over obedience, competent leadership over bureaucratic conformity. The Emperor protects, but sometimes his protection requires servants willing to rebel against systems that claim to serve him, while actually betraying everything he represents. The hunt for Commissar Viktor Krauss would begin soon, but it would be conducted by forces that had lost the moral authority to claim they served the Emperor's will. Chapter 3. The Point of No Return. The investigation into events on Skarth VII arrived in the form of Commissar General Vectis, a career political officer whose reputation for ruthless enforcement of imperial orthodoxy had been built on the executions of 317 soldiers whose only crimes were questioning orders that violated basic military competence. His shuttle touched down at our command post exactly 72 hours after I had transmitted my initial report, its hull bearing the skull and crossbones insignia that marked high-ranking commissariat personnel. I stood in the landing zone as Vectis emerged from his transport flanked by a full squad of Militarum Tempestus scions, whose carapace armor and hellguns marked them as elite troops selected specifically for operations against Imperial forces suspected of disloyalty. Their presence transformed what should have been a routine command inspection into something approaching a military tribunal with predetermined conclusions. Commissar General Vectis himself embodied everything I had once believed represented the highest ideals of Imperial service. His uniform was immaculate despite the harsh conditions on Skarth VII. His augmetic left eye glowed with the crimson light that marked senior commissariat officers, and his bearing carried the absolute confidence of a man who had never questioned an order, regardless of its moral implications. At 53 years old, he commanded respect through fear rather than competence. His authority derived from willingness to execute anyone who challenged the system that had elevated him to power. "Commissar Krauss," he began without preamble, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone whose larynx had been replaced with Vox equipment designed for maximum intimidation effect. "Your report contains allegations of systematic corruption within the regimental command structure that, if true, would require extensive investigation and possible courts-martial for multiple senior officers. However, the circumstances surrounding Colonel Vastian's death and your own actions during the alleged disciplinary crisis suggest alternative explanations for the accusations you have made." His words carried implications that transformed my survival into evidence of guilt, rather than vindication of the choices I had made. In the twisted logic of imperial bureaucracy, the fact that I had lived to report on corruption was proof that I must have participated in treasonous activities rather than evidence that I had acted to preserve imperial interests against internal threats. "Sir," I replied, choosing my words carefully, while knowing that nothing I said would alter conclusions that had been reached before his shuttle had even launched. "The documentation I provided includes falsified casualty reports, intercepted communications revealing deliberate misrepresentation of tactical situations, and witness testimony from multiple sources confirming systematic negligence that resulted in unnecessary Imperial losses." Vectis gestured to one of his scions, who immediately produced a data slate containing what appeared to be alternative versions of the same documents I had submitted. "Commissar, the evidence you claim to have discovered has been examined by Adeptus Mechanicus forensic specialists who have determined that significant portions of it consist of sophisticated forgeries designed to cast blame on loyal Imperial officers for failures that resulted from your own dereliction of duty." The accusation hit me like a physical blow as I realized the true scope of the investigation I was facing. The corruption within the Imperial Guard command structure extended far beyond individual officers to encompass the very institutions responsible for investigating and preventing such corruption. Evidence had been fabricated, testimony had been suppressed, and witnesses had presumably been silenced to protect a system that valued compliance over competence. Furthermore, Vectis continued, his augmetic eye focusing on me with mechanical precision, "Sergeant Molotov and the 9 other soldiers you claim to spare from execution have subsequently been declared missing in action. Their current whereabouts unknown. This convenient disappearance of potential witnesses to your version of events suggests premeditation rather than spontaneous moral awakening." The implication was clear. Either I had murdered the men I claimed to have saved, or they had been eliminated by forces seeking to prevent their testimony from supporting my account of events. In either case, their absence served the narrative that portrayed me as a rogue commissar who had fabricated evidence to justify abandoning his sworn duties. I looked around the command post that had become my responsibility following Colonel Vastian's death, noting the positions of the scions, who had deployed to provide crossfire coverage should I attempt to resist arrest. The men of the regiment watched from carefully maintained distances, their faces showing the careful neutrality of soldiers who had learned that survival required avoiding attention from investigating authorities. "Sir," I said, making one final attempt to preserve some vestige of truth in a situation that had been designed to eliminate inconvenient facts, "I request permission to submit to detailed interrogation under truth-inducing pharmaceuticals so that the actual circumstances of recent events can be established without relying on potentially compromised documentation." Vectis's response embodied the bureaucratic logic that prioritized institutional protection over individual justice. "Commissar Krauss, your request demonstrates either remarkable naivety about the sophistication of conditioning techniques available to potential traitors, or deliberate attempt to delay proceedings while Confederates destroy additional evidence of your crimes. In either case, such interrogation would serve no useful purpose." The arrival of a second shuttle marked the beginning of the final phase of my transformation, from loyal Imperial servant to hunted rogue. This transport carried Captain Dracus of the Mordian Iron Guard's Internal Security Division, a specialist in suppressing military rebellion whose methods included systematic elimination of anyone who might have witnessed events that contradicted official narratives. "Commissar General," Dracus reported as he approached our position, "preliminary investigation of the regiment's personnel files has revealed extensive evidence of seditious activity among the enlisted ranks. Multiple soldiers have been documented expressing support for Commissar Krauss's refusal to carry out lawful executions, while others have been recorded making statements that could be interpreted as questioning the authority of their superior officers." His words confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the purge that would follow my arrest. The investigation wasn't limited to determining my guilt or innocence. It was designed to eliminate anyone who might support my version of events or question the official narrative that would emerge from the proceedings. The men who had fought and died to defend our positions would be posthumously branded as traitors, while those who survived would face execution for the crime of witnessing corruption within their command structure. The moment of decision arrived when Vectis ordered his scions to place me under arrest for treason, dereliction of duty, and conspiracy against Imperial authority. As the elite soldiers moved to restrain me, I realized that submission would not only ensure my own death, but would also condemn every soldier in the regiment who had supported the revelation of truth over comfortable lies. I drew my bolt pistol in one fluid motion, using the combat training that had kept me alive through 15 years of warfare in service to the Emperor's will. The first shot caught the nearest scion in the chest, his carapace armor failing to stop the mass-reactive round that exploded his torso in a spray of blood and ceramite fragments. The second shot shattered Vectis's augmetic eye, the mechanical device sparking and smoking as exotic metals fused under the impact of military-grade ammunition. "All Imperial Guard personnel, this is Commissar Krauss," I announced over the general comm frequency, knowing that my words would be heard throughout the regiment and recorded for future use in propaganda broadcasts. "Commissar General Vectis and Captain Dracus are here to execute loyal Imperial soldiers for the crime of exposing corruption within our command structure. Any man who values truth over institutional protection should consider carefully whether these officers serve the Emperor, his interests, or their own." What followed was 17 minutes of running firefight through the command complex as I attempted to reach the communications center while being pursued by scions whose training in urban warfare made them formidable opponents despite their limited numbers. The regular Imperial Guard soldiers found themselves caught between loyalty to an investigating authority that claimed to represent Imperial justice and support for a commissar who had demonstrated actual concern for their welfare. The resolution came when Sergeant Kellerman, one of the men I had refused to execute, appeared at the entrance to the communications center, with a squad of volunteers who had decided that preservation of truth was worth the risk of being branded as traitors. Their intervention allowed me to access the long-range Vox equipment that connected our position to other Imperial forces throughout the sector. This is Commissar Viktor Krauss of the 47th Mordian Iron Guard. I broadcast on frequencies that would reach dozens of regiments across multiple star systems. I am transmitting evidence of systematic corruption within the Imperial Guard command structure that has resulted in unnecessary casualties and the suppression of loyal soldiers who attempted to expose criminal negligence among their superiors. The data burst that followed contained everything I had managed to compile about the falsified reports, the tactical incompetence, and the institutional protection of officers whose failures had cost thousands of Imperial lives. Within hours, the transmission would reach forces that might be experiencing similar problems with their own command structures, potentially triggering investigations that could expose corruption on a sector-wide scale. Commissar General Vectis, despite his injuries, managed to coordinate a counterattack that forced me to abandon the communications center and retreat toward the regimental motor pool, where vehicles might provide the mobility necessary for escape. His remaining scions had been reinforced by Imperial Guard troops, whose loyalty to institutional authority outweighed their personal opinions about the justice of my cause. Krauss. His voice crackled over the facility's internal comm system, distorted by damage to his Vox equipment, but still carrying the absolute certainty of someone convinced of his own righteousness. Your actions today have damned not only yourself, but every soldier who has supported your delusion of moral superiority. The punishment for treason is death, and that punishment will be extended to anyone who has aided your rebellion against lawful authority. The threat was directed not just at me, but at the men who had risked their lives to support the revelation of truth over institutional convenience. Kellerman and his volunteers would face execution alongside me if captured, their loyalty to principle transformed into evidence of seditious conspiracy through the logic of bureaucratic self-preservation. I reached the motor pool to find that loyal soldiers had already prepared a Chimera transport for departure, its engine running and supplies loaded for extended operations behind enemy lines. Sergeant Molotov emerged from the vehicle's crew compartment, his scarred face showing grim determination, mixed with the resignation of a man who had accepted that survival would require abandoning everything he had once believed about Imperial service. "Commissar," he reported, as explosions from the ongoing firefight echoed through the facility. "We've loaded ammunition, rations, and medical supplies sufficient for 2 weeks of independent operations. The vehicle's cogitator has been programmed with coordinates for several possible extraction points in neutral territory. As we departed the command facility under fire from multiple directions, I realized that I had completed my transformation from enforcer of Imperial discipline to enemy of the state I had served with absolute loyalty for 15 years. The choice between personal survival and institutional protection had been made in favor of truth over comfort, justice over obedience, competent leadership over bureaucratic conformity. The Emperor protects, but his protection increasingly seemed to require opposition to the very institutions that claimed to serve his will. The hunt for Commissar Viktor Krauss and his supporters had begun, conducted by forces that had lost any moral claim to represent Imperial interests. Chapter 4. Hunted. 6 months after fleeing Skarth VII, I had learned that survival as a rogue commissar required skills that no Imperial academy had ever taught. The galaxy was vast, but the reach of Imperial authority was longer, and every spaceport, every military installation, every administrative center carried the potential for recognition and immediate execution. I had become intimately familiar with the underworld networks that existed in the spaces between official Imperial control, trading my knowledge of military operations for safe passage through systems where my face was worth a considerable bounty. The cargo hauler Indomitable Venture represented the kind of vessel that had become my temporary home, officially registered for legitimate shipping operations, but actually serving smugglers, rogue traders, and others whose business required avoiding Imperial scrutiny. Captain Moran, a former Navy officer who had been cashiered for questioning orders during the Third Armageddon War, maintained his ship and crew with the professional competence that marked veterans who understood that survival required excellence rather than mere compliance with regulations. "Commissar," he said, as we approached the jump point that would take us into the Calixis sector, "my contacts in the Merchant Marine are reporting increased arbitrator activity throughout this region. Someone is spending considerable resources to track down persons of interest who match your description." I studied the tactical display that showed our position relative to other vessels in the system, noting the patrol patterns that suggested coordinated search operations rather than routine security sweeps. 3 arbitrator cruisers maintained positions that would allow them to intercept any ship attempting to leave the system, while smaller vessels conducted detailed inspections of commercial traffic that normally would have been processed through automated systems. "Any word on whether they're targeting me specifically or conducting broader operations against suspected dissidents?" I asked, though I suspected that the distinction might be irrelevant for practical purposes. The bounty on my head had grown considerably since my initial transmission about corruption within the Imperial Guard command structure, transforming me from a rogue commissar into a symbol of resistance against institutional authority. Captain Morin's response reflected the pragmatic concerns of someone whose livelihood depended on avoiding official attention while maintaining relationships with clients who operated outside Imperial law. "The intelligence I'm receiving suggests that you've become part of a larger investigation into seditious activity among Imperial military personnel. Several other commissars have been arrested on charges of spreading defeatist sentiment or questioning orders, while entire regiments have been disbanded after accusations of mutinous behavior." His words confirmed my worst fears about the consequences of my actions on Skarth VII. The evidence I had transmitted about command corruption had indeed triggered investigations, but those investigations had been turned against the soldiers who had reported problems rather than the officers who had caused them. Imperial bureaucracy had responded to accusations of systematic negligence by systematically eliminating anyone who might provide testimony supporting those accusations. The irony was bitter. My attempt to expose corruption had provided the corrupt system with justification for purging honest soldiers, while protecting the very officials whose failures had cost thousands of Imperial lives. The broadcasts I had made to preserve truth had been transformed into evidence of treasonous conspiracy, while the documentation I had provided had been dismissed as sophisticated forgeries created by enemies of the state. Sergeant Molotov found me in the cargo hold that served as our temporary barracks, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a picture of sector-wide repression targeting anyone who might support my version of events. His own transformation from loyal Imperial Guard soldier to hunted fugitive had been more difficult than mine. He lacked the command authority and specialized training that made former commissars valuable to criminal organizations, leaving him dependent on my protection in situations where his military skills provided little advantage. "Sir," he reported, using the formal address that maintained military discipline even in our current circumstances, "I've been monitoring arbitrator communications frequencies and picking up references to Operation Cleansing Fire. From the traffic patterns, it appears to be a coordinated effort to identify and eliminate military personnel who have expressed support for your actions or questioned the competence of their superior officers." The name alone revealed the scope of the threat we faced. Imperial authorities weren't conducting a manhunt for specific individuals, but rather implementing a systematic purge designed to eliminate any potential source of criticism about military leadership. The investigation had expanded from my particular case to encompass a broader campaign against what bureaucrats apparently viewed as dangerous, independent thinking among Imperial forces. "How many personnel are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The men I had hoped to protect by exposing corruption were now facing execution because I had provided evidence that challenged official narratives about Imperial military effectiveness. Molotov's response painted a picture of institutional paranoia that exceeded anything I had imagined during my years of loyal service. Intelligence estimates suggest that over 3,000 military personnel across 17 different regiments have been designated as persons of interest for investigation. The criteria appear to include any documented criticism of superior officers, any suggestion that tactical orders were inappropriate, and any expression of support for your refusal to execute loyal soldiers. 3,000 men and women whose only crime was maintaining enough integrity to recognize obvious military incompetence when they encountered it. The scope of the purge revealed that my actions had exposed something far larger than individual corruption. They had challenged a system that required absolute compliance to function, regardless of whether that compliance served imperial interests or merely protected bureaucratic authority. The arrival of a priority transmission interrupted our discussion, its emergency codes indicating information that could affect our immediate survival. Captain Moran's voice echoed through the ship's internal comm system, carrying the tension of someone who had received news that threatened his vessel and crew. All hands, we have received updated intelligence about Imperial operations in this sector. It appears that Inquisitor Vex of the Ordo Hereticus has assumed personal command of efforts to locate and apprehend Commissar Viktor Krauss. The resources being deployed include multiple Space Marine kill teams, arbitrator enforcer squads, and surveillance networks that extend throughout Imperial space. An Inquisitor, the involvement of the Emperor's Holy Inquisition, transformed our situation from dangerous to potentially hopeless. Inquisitors commanded authority that transcended normal Imperial bureaucracy, their mandate to protect humanity from heretical threats, giving them access to resources and personnel that could hunt down fugitives, regardless of where they attempted to hide. Inquisitor Vex had a reputation that preceded him throughout the sectors where he operated. A relentless hunter of dissidents whose methods included torture, assassination, and the systematic destruction of anyone who might provide support to his targets. His investigation of my case would not be limited to establishing guilt or innocence, but would encompass the complete elimination of any evidence that might support my version of events. "Captain," I announced over the comm system, "I'm transferring to your ship's emergency pod. My presence aboard your vessel endangers your crew unnecessarily, and I have no right to involve civilians in a conflict that has become personal between myself and Imperial authority." The response came not from Captain Moran, but from his crew. Veterans of decades spent operating on the margins of Imperial society, who understood that abandoning allies invited similar treatment when their own situations became desperate. "Commissar," called Chief Engineer Valdris, "you're welcome aboard this ship as long as you need refuge. We've all had experience with Imperial justice that prioritizes convenience over truth." Their loyalty was both humbling and terrifying. Humbling because it demonstrated that my actions had inspired respect among people who owed me nothing. Terrifying because it meant that more innocent lives would be lost when Imperial forces finally tracked down our location. Every person who helped me was signing their own death warrant in a system that treated assistance to fugitives as treason, regardless of the circumstances involved. The tactical situation required immediate decisions about our destination and objectives. Remaining in Imperial space would eventually result in capture and execution, but attempting to reach systems beyond Imperial control would require resources and connections that we might not possess. The alternative was to continue operating within Imperial territory, while working to expose the corruption that had made us fugitives in the first place. The choice was made for us when long-range sensors detected the energy signatures of Space Marine vessels moving in formation patterns that suggested coordinated search operations. The kill teams that Inquisitor Vex had deployed were systematically covering every possible route of escape, their advanced equipment and superhuman capabilities making them nearly impossible to evade through conventional means. "Captain," I announced, "set course for the Coronis Expanse. If we can reach Rogue Trader territory, Imperial authority becomes negotiable rather than absolute." The Coronis Expanse represented our best hope for sanctuary, a region of space where Imperial rogue traders operated with sufficient independence to provide protection for fugitives whose knowledge might serve their interests. The journey would require weeks of travel through systems where Imperial forces were actively hunting for us, but the alternative was certain death at the hands of pursuers who had been authorized to use any means necessary to prevent our escape. As the indomitable venture altered course toward the edge of Imperial space, I found myself reflecting on the transformation that had brought me from loyal commissar to hunted rogue. The system I had served with absolute dedication for 15 years had revealed itself to be more concerned with protecting corrupt officials than preserving Imperial fighting strength. The Emperor's supposed servants had prioritized bureaucratic convenience over the lives of soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend humanity from its enemies. Yet the pursuit that followed us across the galaxy also demonstrated that individual actions could challenge institutional corruption, even when those actions resulted in personal destruction. The investigation triggered by my revelations had forced Imperial authorities to show their true priorities, revealing to anyone who cared to observe that institutional protection mattered more than justice or military competence. Sergeant Molotov joined me in the observation deck as we watched the stars wheel past our viewport, both of us knowing that we might never see Imperial space again if our escape attempt succeeded. His presence reminded me that my actions had consequences beyond my own survival. Other lives had been changed by my decision to choose truth over obedience, for better or worse. "Sir," he said quietly, "do you regret refusing to execute those men? Do you think we could have exposed the corruption through official channels if you had maintained your position within the system?" His question cut to the heart of the moral calculation that had driven my transformation from loyal servant to hunted enemy. "No, Sergeant," I replied after long consideration. The system that demanded those executions was the same system that protected the corruption we discovered. Working within it would have required becoming part of it, which would have made effective resistance impossible. The Emperor protects, but his protection sometimes requires servants who are willing to become enemies of the institutions that claim to serve him. The hunt would continue, but our flight had already demonstrated that Imperial authority was not absolute, and that individual conscience could challenge institutional power even in a galaxy that seemed designed to crush independent thought. The stars ahead offered the possibility of sanctuary, while the stars behind held the certainty of death for anyone who dared to question whether the Imperium's supposed servants actually served Imperial interests. Chapter 5. Allies in Darkness. The Rogue Trader Vessel. Sovereign Pride intercepted us at the edge of the Coronis expanse, its massive bulk dwarfing our cargo hauler as it deployed boarding parties with the casual efficiency of a predator claiming territory from lesser creatures. I watched through the viewport as armsmen in void-hardened carapace armor established control points throughout our ship, their movements displaying the professional competence that marked forces serving wealthy and powerful masters rather than bureaucratic institutions. Captain Militant Zerath emerged from the boarding torpedo that had pierced our hull, his augmetic limbs and enhanced physique marking him as someone who had invested considerable resources in personal combat capability. His scarred face bore ritual tattoos that indicated service in the Jericho Reach, while his powered armor showed modifications that suggested both wealth and access to restricted military technology. "Commissar Viktor Krauss," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone whose larynx had been replaced with military-grade Vox equipment. "Rogue Trader Draconis has followed your career with considerable interest since your unfortunate difficulties with Imperial authority. She requests your presence aboard the Sovereign Pride for discussion of matters that might prove mutually beneficial." The invitation was phrased politely, but the armed armsmen surrounding us made clear that refusal was not among the available options. Rogue traders operated with warrants that granted them authority to conduct business beyond the edge of Imperial space, their independence balanced by obligations to serve Imperial interests when called upon. My status as a fugitive from Imperial justice created complications that could be resolved through either protection or betrayal, depending on calculations I couldn't predict. The interior of the Sovereign Pride revealed wealth that exceeded anything I had encountered during my service with conventional Imperial forces. Gothic architecture soared overhead in chambers large enough to house entire regiments, while decorative elements incorporated precious metals and exotic materials that represented the accumulated profits of decades spent trading in regions where Imperial authority was merely theoretical. The vessel was less a ship than a mobile palace, its corridors filled with servants, guards, and specialists who maintained an organization that operated according to its own laws. Rogue trader Cassandra Draconis received us in a throne room that rivaled anything found in Imperial palaces. her elevated position allowing her to observe visitors while maintaining the psychological advantage that came from superior height and elaborate decoration. At 47 years old, she commanded respect through a combination of inherited authority and personal capability that had been refined through decades of operating in situations where failure meant death. Her augmetic left arm ended in a weapon that appeared to be a custom-built bolt pistol, while her natural right hand wore rings that I recognized as archaeotech devices capable of generating personal force fields. Her clothing combined practical functionality with ceremonial elements that indicated both her noble heritage and her hard-earned status as someone who had survived long enough to accumulate significant personal power. "Commissar Krauss," she began, her voice carrying the cultured accent of Terran nobility mixed with the pragmatic directness of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Your situation presents both opportunities and complications for those of us who operate in the spaces between imperial control and absolute independence." I remained standing as protocol demanded, though my position at the bottom of the steps leading to her throne made clear the power dynamic that governed our interaction. "My lady," I replied formally, "I appreciate your willingness to provide sanctuary, though I suspect such protection comes with expectations that I may not be positioned to fulfill." Her laugh carried genuine amusement, rather than the calculated intimidation that marked most displays of authority among imperial nobility. "Your reputation for directness is well-deserved, Commissar. Indeed, there are certain services that someone with your background and current circumstances might provide in exchange for continued protection from imperial pursuit." The proposition she outlined revealed the complexity of relationships that existed beyond the edge of official imperial space, where rogue traders maintain their independence through careful balance between serving imperial interests and pursuing personal profit. My knowledge of imperial military operations and command structures made me valuable as an intelligence source, while my fugitive status ensured that I would be motivated to provide accurate information rather than risk betrayal to pursuing authorities. "The Calixis sector is experiencing increased Imperial Guard activity that affects shipping routes and commercial operations throughout the region," she explained, activating a hololithic display that showed military movements across dozens of star systems. "Your insight into Imperial tactical doctrine and command decision-making processes would help my organization avoid unnecessary complications while maintaining profitable relationships with legitimate Imperial authorities." The intelligence she provided painted a picture of sector-wide military mobilization that extended far beyond the search for individual fugitives. Imperial Guard regiments were being repositioned to protect commercial interests and suppress civil unrest, while arbitrator forces conducted investigations into seditious activity that targeted anyone who had expressed criticism of military leadership or questioned official reports about ongoing conflicts. "Furthermore," she continued, her augmetic fingers manipulating control interfaces that revealed additional layers of information, "recent developments suggest that the corruption you exposed within the Imperial Guard command structure was not limited to individual officers, but represents systematic problems that affect military operations throughout the sector." Evidence displayed on the hololithic projector confirmed what I had suspected, but hoped was not true. The falsified reports and tactical incompetence I had encountered on Skarth VII were part of a pattern that extended across multiple regiments and command levels. Imperial forces were being systematically weakened by officials who prioritized personal advancement over military effectiveness, while soldiers who attempted to report these problems faced execution for seditious behavior. Sergeant Molotov, who had remained silent during the initial negotiations, stepped forward to examine tactical data that showed the full scope of the crisis facing Imperial military forces. "My lady," he said respectfully, "these patterns suggest that enemy forces are exploiting weaknesses created by corrupt Imperial commanders. Several of these defensive failures appear to have been deliberately engineered to provide advantages to hostile forces." His observation revealed implications that transformed our understanding of the threat we faced from mere bureaucratic corruption to potential treason involving collaboration with enemies of humanity. Imperial officers weren't simply incompetent, some of them were actively working to ensure Imperial defeats while maintaining plausible deniability about their treasonous activities. Precisely, Draconis confirmed, her expression showing the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been validated by independent analysis. My commercial operations have suffered losses due to Imperial military failures that should not have occurred, given the resources and intelligence available to Imperial commanders. The patterns suggest coordination between corrupt Imperial officials and hostile forces that view weakened Imperial defenses as opportunities for territorial expansion. The scope of the conspiracy she outlined exceeded anything I had imagined during my years of service within the Imperial command structure. We were facing not just individual corruption, but systematic betrayal that threatened Imperial control over entire sectors, orchestrated by officials who had sworn oaths to defend the territories they were actively compromising. "What specific assistance do you require?" I asked, knowing that survival would depend on providing services valuable enough to justify the risks involved in protecting Imperial fugitives from pursuing authorities. Her response outlined operations that would require my knowledge of Imperial military doctrine, combined with access to intelligence networks that operated beyond official oversight. "I need detailed analysis of Imperial Guard deployment patterns that will allow my shipping operations to avoid areas where military commanders might attempt to requisition civilian vessels for tactical support. Additionally, I require assessment of which Imperial officials can be trusted to honor commercial agreements versus those who might use their authority to confiscate cargo or detain personnel." The work she described represented a form of intelligence analysis that fell somewhere between legitimate business research and preparation for activities that Imperial authorities would certainly classify as treasonous. Yet the alternative was to remain fugitives without resources or protection, dependent on the charity of smugglers and criminals, whose own survival requirements might conflict with our safety. Over the following weeks, I established myself as a valuable asset to Draconis' organization while learning to operate in the morally ambiguous environment that existed beyond direct Imperial control. The intelligence work I performed revealed the true extent of corruption within Imperial military forces, while also exposing the practical consequences of that corruption for civilians and commercial interests throughout the region. My analysis of Imperial Guard deployment patterns uncovered evidence of systematic manipulation designed to create tactical vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit with minimal risk. Regiments were being positioned in locations where they could be easily isolated and destroyed, while supply lines were deliberately left unprotected to ensure that successful Imperial operations would fail due to logistical breakdown. "The patterns are too consistent to represent mere incompetence," I reported during one of my regular briefings to Draconis and her senior staff. "Someone is coordinating these deployment decisions to ensure maximum Imperial losses while maintaining the appearance of legitimate military operations." The investigation that followed my initial analysis revealed connections between corrupt Imperial officials and merchant houses that had profited from Imperial military failures through salvage operations and equipment sales to replacement forces. The conspiracy involved not just military commanders, but also civilian authorities who had financial incentives to ensure that Imperial forces remained weakened and dependent on outside support. Sergeant Molotov proved invaluable in this investigation, his experience as an enlisted soldier providing insights into operational realities that complemented my understanding of command decision-making processes. Together, we developed intelligence products that allowed Draconis to protect her commercial interests, while also identifying opportunities to expose the treasonous network that was systematically betraying Imperial forces. "Sir," he reported during one of our private conferences, "I've been analyzing the casualty reports from regiments that experienced the deployment anomalies you identified. In every case, the units that suffered the highest losses were also the ones whose commanders had previously reported problems with supply shortages or inadequate tactical support." His observation revealed the systematic nature of the betrayal we were investigating. Imperial officers who attempted to maintain military effectiveness were being deliberately placed in situations where they would be killed, while corrupt officials who participated in the conspiracy were protected through preferential assignments and adequate logistical support. The moral complexity of our situation became increasingly apparent as our investigation progressed. We were fugitives from Imperial justice, working for a rogue trader whose interests did not necessarily align with Imperial welfare. Yet our research was exposing treason that threatened the survival of loyal Imperial forces throughout the sector. The choice between personal safety and duty to the Emperor remained as difficult as it had been on Skarth VII, though the circumstances had changed dramatically. Rogue trader Draconis proved to be an honorable employer whose commitment to protecting her allies extended beyond mere business calculation. When Imperial kill teams tracked our location to her territory, she deployed her own military forces to ensure our safety while maintaining plausible deniability about the specific services we provided to her organization. "Commissar," she informed me as her forces prepared to engage Space Marine pursuers, "your intelligence work has saved dozens of my ships and hundreds of my personnel from Imperial military seizures that would have been justified through fabricated charges of seditious activity. Honor demands that I provide equivalent protection in return." The battle that followed demonstrated the resources available to those who operated beyond Imperial authority while maintaining sufficient wealth and power to challenge direct Imperial enforcement. Draconis' forces included former Imperial Guard veterans, discharged Space Marines, and mercenaries whose equipment and training rivaled anything available to official Imperial military units. The Emperor protects, but his protection sometimes required alliance with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional Imperial authority. Our sanctuary among the rogue traders provided safety, but it also committed us to a path that would make return to legitimate Imperial service impossible, even if political circumstances changed in our favor. Chapter 6. Deeper into the web. The intelligence network that rogue trader Draconis had constructed over decades of operation in the Coronis Expanse provided access to information that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy we were investigating. Her agents included former Imperial officials who had been cashiered for refusing to participate in corrupt schemes, discharged military personnel whose competence had made them inconvenient for corrupt superiors, and civilian merchants whose businesses had been destroyed by officials who demanded bribes they could not afford to pay. Captain Helena Voss of the merchant vessel. Dutiful service exemplified the kind of ally whose testimony could expose the systematic nature of Imperial corruption if authorities could be found who were willing to listen. Her ship had been seized by Imperial forces under false pretenses 3 years earlier, its cargo confiscated and its crew imprisoned on charges of seditious behavior that were later revealed to have been entirely fabricated. Commissioner General Marcus demanded payment of 50,000 throne gelts for safe passage through his sector, she explained during a briefing conducted aboard the Sovereign Pride, her scarred hands betraying the manual labor she had been forced to perform in Imperial detention facilities. When I explained that my profit margins could not support such payments, he had my vessel searched by arbitrators, who conveniently discovered evidence of contraband that had obviously been planted during the inspection. Her experience represented a pattern that extended throughout Imperial commercial operations in the region, officials who used their authority to extort payments from legitimate businesses, while protecting criminal organizations that could afford higher bribes. The corruption we were investigating wasn't limited to military incompetence, but encompassed systematic abuse of Imperial authority for personal enrichment. The data that Draconis' intelligence network had compiled painted a picture of institutional breakdown that extended far beyond individual misconduct to encompass coordinated criminal activity that threatened Imperial control over entire systems. Military commanders worked with civilian officials to create artificial crises that justified emergency powers, which were then used to confiscate resources and eliminate potential witnesses to their activities. The pattern is remarkably consistent, I observed, as I reviewed case files that documented hundreds of similar incidents across the sector. Imperial authority is being used to protect criminal enterprises while eliminating legitimate businesses and competent military personnel who might expose the conspiracy. My analysis revealed that the corruption we were investigating had evolved into something approaching treason through its systematic weakening of Imperial defenses and economic infrastructure. The officials involved weren't simply stealing resources. They were actively undermining Imperial capacity to resist external threats, while positioning themselves to profit from the chaos that would result from Imperial collapse. Sergeant Molotov had established relationships with discharged Imperial Guard personnel, whose units had been disbanded after reporting supply shortages and tactical problems to superior officers. Their testimony provided ground-level perspective on how the conspiracy operated within military command structures, transforming competent units into ineffective forces through deliberate sabotage disguised as administrative inefficiency. They would reassign our best officers to other units just before major operations, reported former Sergeant Kellox of the disbanded 23rd Cadian Shock Troops, his cybernetic arm a reminder of wounds suffered during a battle where inadequate supplies had resulted in tactical defeat despite superior Imperial numbers. Then they would place inexperienced commanders in charge while ensuring that ammunition shipments arrived late and medical support was positioned too far from the front lines to be effective. His account revealed the sophisticated methods used to ensure Imperial military failures while maintaining plausible deniability about deliberate sabotage. The officials involved had developed techniques for weakening Imperial forces that appeared to result from administrative errors rather than treasonous intent, making investigation difficult even when honest authorities attempted to identify the sources of systematic failures. The breakthrough in our investigation came when Draconis' agents intercepted communications between corrupt Imperial officials and representatives of the Tau Empire, revealing that the conspiracy included direct collaboration with Xenos forces seeking to expand their influence within Imperial territory. The evidence showed payment of substantial sums to Imperial commanders who agreed to position their forces in locations where Tau forces could destroy them with minimal risk. This transcends mere corruption, I reported to Draconis during an emergency briefing convened to address the implications of what we had discovered. We are documenting systematic treason that involves direct collaboration with enemies of humanity. The officials involved are not just stealing resources, they are actively working to ensure Imperial defeats in exchange for personal profit. The communications we had intercepted revealed plans for coordinated Tau offensive operations that would exploit the vulnerabilities created by corrupted Imperial deployments, while corrupt officials would use the resulting chaos to seize additional power under emergency authorities that suspended normal legal protections for Imperial citizens. The moral implications of our discovery forced us to confront the possibility that our obligation to expose treason might require actions that would further compromise our status as Imperial fugitives. The evidence we had compiled could save thousands of Imperial lives if presented to honest authorities, but revealing our sources would expose Draconis' intelligence network to Imperial retaliation, while potentially compromising our own safety. The question, Draconis observed as we reviewed our options, is whether Imperial authorities who might receive this intelligence can be trusted to act on it rather than suppress it to protect the officials involved. Your own experience suggests that institutional loyalty often trumps evidence of individual corruption. Her point was devastatingly accurate. The same system that had branded me a traitor for exposing military incompetence was unlikely to welcome evidence of systematic treason involving collaboration with Xenos forces. Officials who might benefit from the conspiracy would have strong incentives to suppress our evidence while eliminating anyone who might provide testimony supporting our accusations. The solution came from an unexpected source when former Inquisitor Cassius Thanodral contacted Draconis through channels that suggested he had been monitoring our investigation with professional interest. His credentials indicated decades of service with the Ordo Xenos before his resignation following disagreements with superiors about appropriate responses to evidence of corruption within Imperial institutions. Rogue trader Draconis, he announced during a secure Vox transmission that bypassed normal Imperial communication networks. I have followed the intelligence work conducted by your associates with considerable attention. The evidence they have compiled confirms suspicions that I have harbored for years about the scope of corruption within Imperial command structures. The meeting that followed was conducted aboard a neutral vessel in the depths of the Coronis Expanse, far from any Imperial authority that might attempt to interfere with free exchange of information. Thanadral's presence represented the possibility of finding Imperial authorities who retained sufficient integrity to act on evidence of treason, regardless of the political complications involved. "Commissar Krauss," he said, as we reviewed the intelligence we had compiled. "Your initial transmission about corruption within the Imperial Guard command structure triggered investigations that revealed the scope of the problem extends far beyond what you observed on Skarth VII. However, those investigations also revealed that many of the officials responsible for addressing corruption are themselves compromised. His confirmation of what we had suspected created both opportunities and dangers for our continued operations. The evidence we possessed could indeed save Imperial lives and preserve Imperial territory from Xenos expansion, but presenting it through normal channels would likely result in our execution, while allowing the actual traitors to escape consequences for their actions. The plan that emerged from our discussions required careful coordination between Draconis' intelligence network, Thanadrol's contacts within the Inquisition, and my own knowledge of Imperial military operations to ensure that evidence of treason reached authorities capable of acting on it effectively. The operation would require exposing ourselves to considerable risk, while trusting that officials we had never met would prove more honorable than those who had driven us into exile. "The timing is critical," Thanadrol explained as we finalized operational details. "The Tau offensive is scheduled to begin within standard months, coordinated with Imperial troop deployments that will place loyal regiments in positions where they can be easily destroyed. If we can expose the conspiracy before those deployments are finalized, thousands of Imperial lives can be saved." The mission parameters required infiltrating Imperial space while avoiding the kill teams that continued to hunt for us, accessing secure communication networks that would allow us to transmit evidence to trustworthy authorities, and maintaining operational security that would prevent corrupt officials from suppressing the intelligence before it could be acted upon. Sergeant Molotov volunteered for the most dangerous aspects of the operation, using his knowledge of Imperial Guard communication protocols to access networks that would normally be protected against unauthorized intrusion. His willingness to risk his life for soldiers he had never met embodied the dedication to Imperial service that had driven our initial refusal to execute loyal personnel. "Sir," he said, as we prepared for insertion into Imperial territory, "I joined the Imperial Guard to protect the Emperor's subjects from their enemies. The enemies we're fighting now wear Imperial uniforms and carry Imperial authority, but they're still enemies of everything the Imperium claims to represent." His words captured the moral complexity of our situation. We were Imperial fugitives working to preserve Imperial interests against Imperial officials who had betrayed their oaths in favor of personal profit and alien collaboration. The paradox was painful, but the alternative was allowing treason to succeed, while loyal Imperial forces were systematically destroyed by those who claimed to command them. The Emperor protects, but his protection increasingly required opposition to institutions that claimed to serve him while actually serving the enemies of humanity. Our mission would test whether truth could overcome institutional corruption, or whether the forces of betrayal had become too powerful to be challenged by individual conscience and determination. The insertion would begin within hours, carrying us back into Imperial space where capture meant certain death, but where success might preserve the lives of thousands of loyal Imperial servants who deserved better from the system they served. Chapter 7. Behind Enemy Lines. The infiltration of Imperial space required techniques that combined my commissarial training with the irregular warfare methods that Draconis' organization had perfected through decades of operating beyond legal boundaries. Our insertion team consisted of myself, Sergeant Molotov, and two of Draconis' most experienced agents, former Imperial Navy Lieutenant Commander Jessa Carven and ex-arbitrator enforcer Marcus Thane, both of whom had been cashiered for refusing to participate in corrupt schemes that violated their oaths of service. The vessel that carried us into Imperial territory was a modified cargo hauler whose legitimate shipping manifests concealed specialized equipment for accessing secure Imperial communication networks and extracting intelligence from protected databases. Captain Morin had volunteered to command the operation despite the certainty that capture would result in execution for all personnel involved, his loyalty to our cause representing the bonds that developed between individuals who had chosen truth over institutional protection. "Commissar," Lieutenant Commander Carven reported as we approached the orbital facilities above Mordian Prime, Imperial Navy traffic control is implementing enhanced security protocols that require additional documentation and extended inspection procedures. Our forged credentials should withstand routine scrutiny, but detailed investigation would reveal discrepancies that could compromise the mission. The target we had selected represented both opportunity and extreme danger. Mordian Prime served as a sector command center where intelligence about troop deployments and tactical planning was processed and distributed to Imperial forces throughout the region. Access to the command networks would provide the evidence we needed to expose the conspiracy. But those same networks were protected by security measures designed to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration we were attempting. The approach required patience and careful timing, as we waited for legitimate shipping traffic that would provide cover for our insertion into the orbital infrastructure. Imperial cargo vessels maintained schedules that were carefully monitored by authorities whose suspicion of irregular activity had been heightened by reports of rogue commissars and seditious military personnel operating in the region. Morcock 37. This is Mordian Prime traffic control, came the crisp voice of the orbital controller whose routine challenged our vessel according to standard security protocols. Transmit your shipping manifests and crew certifications for verification processing. Captain Morin's response embodied the casual professionalism that marked legitimate commercial operators, whose paperwork was always in order and whose cargo was exactly what their manifests claimed. Mordian Prime Control. This is Morcock 37 with agricultural products from Demeter's garden, bound for distribution centers in the primary hive. Transmitting documentation now. The inspection process took 3 hours, during which Imperial security personnel conducted detailed analysis of our forged credentials, while we maintained the appearance of routine commercial activity. The cargo holds contained actual agricultural products purchased through legitimate channels, while our specialized equipment was concealed within shipping containers that would appear normal unless subjected to intensive examination. Authorization to dock came with restrictions that complicated our mission, but provided access to the orbital infrastructure we needed to reach Imperial command networks. Morcock 37, you are cleared for docking at Commercial Bay 17. Offloading will commence at 0800 hours under arbitrator supervision, with all crew members required to remain aboard during cargo transfer operations. The limitations meant that we would have minimal time and restricted movement for accessing the command networks that contained the intelligence we needed to expose the conspiracy. Ex-arbitrator Thane proved invaluable in navigating the security procedures that governed access to restricted areas, his knowledge of enforcement protocols allowing us to move through the orbital facility without triggering alarms that would bring immediate investigation. The command center is located in Sector 7, protected by both physical security and electronic countermeasures, he explained, as we reviewed our approach routes through service corridors that were monitored less intensively than primary passages. Access requires biometric identification from authorized personnel, but maintenance schedules create opportunities for brief periods when security systems are reset for routine servicing. The window of opportunity would last exactly 17 minutes, during which maintenance crews would have physical access to security terminals while electronic monitoring systems were temporarily disabled for diagnostic procedures. Our success would depend on precise timing and the ability to extract massive amounts of data within an extremely limited time frame, while avoiding detection by security personnel, whose training emphasized preventing exactly this kind of unauthorized access. Sergeant Molotov had prepared specialized cogitator viruses that could penetrate Imperial data networks and copy protected files without leaving traces of the intrusion, his technical expertise having been developed through years of maintaining communication equipment under field conditions. The programs he had created would automatically identify and extract intelligence related to troop deployments, supply allocations, and command communications that could expose the treasonous conspiracy we were investigating. The viruses are designed to prioritize communications between Imperial commanders and suspected Tau agents, he explained as we prepared for infiltration of the command center. If the conspiracy is as extensive as our evidence suggests, those communications should provide definitive proof of collaboration with Xenos forces. The penetration began at 0247 hours when maintenance crews initiated their scheduled servicing of security systems throughout the orbital facility. Lieutenant Commander Carven used her knowledge of Imperial Navy protocols to gain access to service areas where our team could approach the command center without triggering automated alarms, while ex-arbitrator Thane provided identification codes that would satisfy security challenges if we encountered patrol personnel. The command center itself occupied 3 levels of the orbital facility's most secure section, its chambers filled with tactical displays and communication equipment that processed intelligence from across the sector. The night shift consisted of 6 personnel whose attention was focused on routine monitoring duties rather than the possibility of infiltration by rogue Imperial agents seeking evidence of systematic treason. Guard rotation occurs every 2 hours, Thane whispered, as we observed the security patterns that governed access to the restricted terminals containing the intelligence we needed. The next rotation begins in 14 minutes, which will provide a brief window when attention is focused on shift change procedures rather than anomalous activity. The data extraction required Molotov to access 3 separate terminal networks, while remaining undetected by personnel who were trained to recognize unauthorized intrusion attempts. His cogitator viruses proved remarkably effective at penetrating security protocols and copying protected files, their sophisticated design allowing them to operate without triggering the alarms that would normally respond to unauthorized access. "Sir," he reported through our encrypted communication link, "I'm accessing communications between Sector Commander Valius and an individual identified as Watercast Diplomatic Representative Shazel Kauyon. The content appears to confirm payment arrangements in exchange for tactical intelligence about Imperial troop deployments." The evidence he was recovering exceeded our most pessimistic estimates about the scope of the conspiracy. Imperial commanders weren't just positioning their forces poorly, they were actively providing tactical intelligence to Tau forces in exchange for personal profit. The treason we were documenting involved systematic betrayal of Imperial forces to alien enemies, with corrupt officials literally selling the lives of loyal soldiers for xenotic currency. Additional files revealed the full extent of the coordination between corrupt Imperial officials and Tau expansion efforts. Supply shortages that had contributed to Imperial military failures were deliberately created through arrangements with civilian contractors who diverted resources to Tau forces, while tactical deployments that placed Imperial regiments in vulnerable positions were coordinated with Tau military planning to ensure maximum Imperial casualties. The pattern extends across 17 different regiments, Molotov continued, as his viruses extracted years of incriminating communications. Imperial losses that were attributed to tactical errors or supply problems were actually the result of systematic betrayal involving collaboration with Tau forces. The evidence we were gathering would provide definitive proof of treason on a scale that exceeded anything in Imperial history, but the magnitude of the conspiracy also suggested that exposing it would trigger massive retaliation against anyone who attempted to reveal the truth. The officials involved commanded sufficient authority to suppress investigations while eliminating witnesses, making our survival dependent on reaching trustworthy authorities before the conspiracy could silence us. The extraction was completed with minutes to spare before security protocols would have detected our intrusion, Molotov's viruses successfully copying thousands of files that documented systematic collaboration between Imperial officials and Tau forces. The intelligence we had gathered would save thousands of Imperial lives if it could be transmitted to authorities capable of acting on it, but it would also ensure our execution if the conspiracy discovered our activities before we could reach safety. "Data extraction complete," Molotov reported as we began our withdrawal from the command center. "The evidence is conclusive. We have documented communications proving that Imperial commanders have been providing tactical intelligence to Tau forces in exchange for payment, while civilian officials have been diverting military supplies to support Tau expansion efforts. Our escape from the orbital facility required the same careful timing and precise execution that had enabled our infiltration. But the return journey carried additional risks because our presence was no longer completely unknown to facility security systems. The cogitator viruses had been designed to avoid detection, but sophisticated analysis might reveal traces of unauthorized access that could trigger investigation. Captain Morin received us aboard the cargo hauler with the relief of someone who had spent hours wondering whether his crew would return alive from their penetration of Imperial security. "Commissar," he reported as we departed Mordian Prime orbit. Long-range sensors are detecting increased Imperial Navy patrol activity in this system. It appears that someone suspects unusual activity, though specific targeting suggests they haven't identified our vessel yet. The intelligence we had gathered required immediate transmission to former Inquisitor Thanadral, whose contacts within the Inquisition represented our best hope for reaching authorities who would act on evidence of systematic treason rather than suppressing it to protect institutional interests. The communication protocols we used would encrypt the data to prevent interception, but the volume of information we were transmitting would create electromagnetic signatures that Imperial authorities might detect and track. "Sir," Sergeant Molotov observed as we prepared the transmission that would expose the conspiracy to potential investigation. "The evidence we recovered proves that the corruption we initially discovered was merely the surface of something far more dangerous. Imperial officials haven't just been stealing resources, they've been actively working to ensure Imperial defeats while profiting from collaboration with Xenos forces." His words captured the horrifying scope of what we had discovered. Not just individual corruption or institutional incompetence, but systematic betrayal that threatened Imperial control over entire sectors. The officials we were exposing had violated every oath they had sworn, while literally selling the lives of loyal Imperial forces to alien enemies for personal profit. The transmission to Thanadral was completed as we reached the edge of the system, carrying with it evidence that could expose treason on an unprecedented scale if it reached authorities willing to act on it. Whether our efforts would succeed in saving Imperial lives or merely ensure our own destruction remained to be determined, but we had at least provided truth with a chance to compete against institutional corruption. The Emperor protects, but his protection increasingly required servants willing to risk everything to expose those who claimed to serve him while actually serving his enemies. Our mission had succeeded in gathering evidence, but the larger battle between truth and corruption was only beginning. Chapter 8: Truth and Consequences. The response to our intelligence transmission came within 48 hours, delivered through encrypted channels that confirmed former Inquisitor Thanadral had successfully presented our evidence to authorities capable of acting on it without compromise from the conspiracy we had exposed. The communication carried authorization codes that indicated involvement of the highest levels of Imperial authority, suggesting that the scope of the treason we had documented had triggered responses normally reserved for threats to the stability of the Imperium itself. "Commissar Krauss," the message began in Thanadral's distinctive formal style. "The evidence you provided has been verified through independent sources and confirmed to represent systematic collaboration with Xenos forces on a scale that threatens Imperial control over multiple sectors. Lord Inquisitor Valerius has assumed personal command of operations to neutralize the conspiracy, with authorization from the High Lords of Terror to employ any means necessary to preserve Imperial security." The involvement of a Lord Inquisitor represented vindication of everything we had risked to expose, but it also confirmed that the conspiracy had grown powerful enough to require the highest levels of Imperial authority to counter effectively. The officials we had exposed commanded sufficient resources and influence to threaten the stability of Imperial governance itself, making their elimination a matter of strategic necessity rather than mere criminal justice. The operational plan that Thanadral outlined required our continued cooperation as witnesses, whose testimony would be essential for identifying all participants in the conspiracy and ensuring that none escaped to establish similar arrangements in other sectors. Our expertise in Imperial military operations and first-hand knowledge of the corruption we had investigated made us valuable assets whose survival had become important to Imperial interests. "You will be granted full pardons for any alleged crimes committed during your investigation," the transmission continued, "contingent upon your cooperation with ongoing operations to eliminate the treasonous network you have exposed. Your service to the Emperor's interests transcends any technical violations of Imperial law that resulted from your pursuit of truth." The offer of redemption represented everything I had hoped for during the months of exile and pursuit that had followed my refusal to execute loyal Imperial soldiers. Yet acceptance would require returning to Imperial space, where the conspiracy still commanded significant resources, and where our knowledge made us targets for elimination by forces that had demonstrated their willingness to murder Imperial personnel to protect their secrets. Sergeant Molotov's response to the opportunity embodied the dedication to duty that had driven our entire investigation. "Sir," he said, as we reviewed the operational requirements for cooperation with the Inquisition, "we swore oaths to protect the Emperor's subjects from their enemies. The fact that some of those enemies wear Imperial uniforms doesn't change our obligations." Rogue trader Draconis provided transportation back into Imperial space aboard the Sovereign Pride, her continued support representing the honor that marked those who had chosen principle over profit in their relationships with allies. The journey would carry us directly into the most dangerous phase of our campaign against the conspiracy, where our value as witnesses was balanced by the threat we represented to officials who commanded military forces and assassination capabilities. "Commissar," she said as we prepared for departure from the relative safety of the Coronis expanse, "your investigation has provided intelligence that saved dozens of my commercial operations from Imperial seizure under fabricated charges. Honor demands that I ensure your safe arrival at the rendezvous coordinates, regardless of the risks involved." The reunion with Imperial authority took place aboard the battle barge Emperor's Wrath, a vessel whose very name represented the justice that would be brought against those who had betrayed their oaths in favor of alien collaboration. Lord Inquisitor Valerius received us in a chamber whose austere decoration emphasized function over ceremony, his personal bearing reflecting decades spent hunting threats to Imperial security without regard for political convenience or institutional protection. At 67 years old, he commanded respect through demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority, his scarred features bearing witness to campaigns against enemies that ranged from heretical cults to Xenos infiltration networks. His augmetic right arm terminated in a weapon that appeared to be a custom-built plasma pistol, while his natural left hand bore rings that indicated access to archaeotech devices normally reserved for the highest levels of Imperial authority. "Commissar Krauss," he began without ceremony, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the fate of entire worlds. "Your investigation has exposed systematic treason that threatens Imperial security throughout this sector. The conspiracy you documented includes over 40 Imperial commanders and 70 civilian officials, whose collaboration with Tau forces has resulted in the deaths of approximately 12,000 loyal Imperial soldiers. The scope of the betrayal exceeded even our most pessimistic estimates about the extent of the conspiracy, transforming what we had initially believed to be corruption into warfare against the Imperium conducted by those who claimed to serve Imperial interests. The officials involved hadn't simply stolen resources. They had actively worked to ensure Imperial defeats while providing intelligence and material support to alien enemies. The evidence you provided has been corroborated through interrogation of captured Tau agents and analysis of communication intercepts that confirm the systematic nature of the collaboration," Valerius continued, activating a hololithic display that showed the full extent of the network we had exposed. "Your service has prevented planned Tau offensive operations that would have resulted in the loss of 3 star systems and the deaths of millions of Imperial citizens." The tactical analysis he presented revealed how close the conspiracy had come to achieving permanent success in its campaign to weaken Imperial defenses while facilitating Tau expansion. The troop deployments we had documented would have created vulnerabilities that Tau forces could have exploited to establish permanent footholds within Imperial territory, while the supply diversions would have ensured that Imperial response capabilities remained inadequate to counter the offensive. The operation to eliminate the conspiracy required careful coordination to prevent participants from escaping or destroying evidence that could implicate additional collaborators. Lord Inquisitor Valerius had deployed Space Marine kill teams, arbitrator enforcement squads, and specialized Inquisition agents to conduct simultaneous arrests across 17 different star systems, ensuring that the conspiracy couldn't warn its members or implement contingency plans for avoiding justice. "Your role will be to provide tactical analysis and witness testimony that ensures all participants are identified and eliminated," Valerius explained as he outlined our continued involvement in operations against the conspiracy. "The knowledge you gained during your investigation makes you uniquely qualified to recognize patterns of corruption and identify individuals whose involvement might not be apparent," through conventional investigation methods. The mission represented both vindication of our choices and continuation of the dangerous path we had followed since refusing to execute loyal soldiers on Skarth VII. We would be working with an Imperial authority again, but as specialists whose expertise had been earned through rebellion against corrupt officials rather than loyal service within established systems. Sergeant Molotov proved invaluable during the identification phase of the operation. His knowledge of Imperial Guard operational procedures allowing him to recognize signs of corruption that might escape notice by investigators unfamiliar with military logistics. His analysis of supply records and communication patterns helped identify civilian officials whose involvement in the conspiracy had been concealed through sophisticated accounting procedures. "Sir," he reported during one of our briefings on conspiracy participants, "the pattern of supply diversions suggests coordination between military commanders and civilian contractors that extends back at least 5 years. The sophistication of the arrangement indicates that this wasn't opportunistic corruption, but rather systematic betrayal that was planned and implemented over an extended period." The trials that followed our investigation established precedents for Imperial justice that would influence how similar cases were handled throughout Imperial space. The evidence we had gathered provided conclusive proof of treason that made defense impossible, while the scope of the conspiracy demonstrated the need for enhanced oversight of Imperial military and civilian officials whose authority created opportunities for betrayal. Colonel Vastian, whose death on Skarth VII had initiated our investigation, was posthumously revealed to have been among the earliest participants in the conspiracy, his incompetence having been motivated by payments from Tau agents rather than mere military inadequacy. The executions I had performed under his orders had eliminated soldiers whose competence threatened to expose the systematic failures that his treason required. "The irony is bitter," I observed to Lord Inquisitor Valerius as we reviewed the evidence that revealed the true scope of what we had uncovered. My refusal to execute loyal soldiers saved not just their lives, but potentially saved Imperial control over this entire sector. The conspiracy depended on eliminating competent personnel who might have recognized and reported the systematic failures that facilitated Tau expansion. His response reflected the pragmatic approach that marked senior Imperial officials who had learned to prioritize results over procedural correctness. "Commissar, your actions demonstrated that individual conscience can serve Imperial interests more effectively than blind obedience to corrupt authority. The precedent is dangerous but necessary. Imperial servants must be prepared to distinguish between legitimate orders and treasonous commands." The resolution of our case included formal recognition of our service to Imperial interests, with decorations and promotions that acknowledged our contributions to preserving Imperial security. Yet the experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of Imperial service and the obligations that came with authority to enforce Imperial justice. "Sir," Sergeant Molotov said as we prepared for our next assignment with the Inquisition, "I joined the Imperial Guard to protect the Emperor's subjects from their enemies. I never expected that some of the most dangerous enemies would be those who claim to serve the Emperor while actually betraying everything he represents." His words captured the moral complexity that would define our continued service within Imperial institutions that we had learned could be corrupted from within. The conspiracy we had exposed had been eliminated, but the conditions that had allowed it to develop remained unchanged, requiring constant vigilance against future betrayals. The Emperor protects, but his protection requires servants who understand that institutional authority must be balanced against individual conscience when those institutions become vehicles for the enemies they claim to fight. Our investigation had demonstrated that truth could overcome corruption when individuals were willing to risk everything to expose it. But it had also revealed that such risks would be necessary again whenever convenience threatened to triumph over justice. The brutal life of a rogue commissar had taught me that loyalty to the Emperor sometimes required opposition to those who claimed to serve him, and that Imperial justice was best preserved by those who understood that principles mattered more than position, truth more than comfort, and duty more than personal survival. My name is Viktor Krauss, former Rogue Commissar, current servant of the Emperor's Inquisition, and I have learned that the greatest threats to the Imperium often come from within rather than without. The hunt continues, but now I hunt with Imperial authority behind me, and the knowledge that individual conscience can triumph over institutional corruption when guided by unwavering dedication to truth and justice. The Emperor protects, and sometimes his protection requires those who serve him to become temporary enemies of the systems that claim to represent his will.